Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping back into a world of dust, heat, and the kind of quiet that feels like a physical weight on your chest. You are standing on the edge of the known world, or at least the edge of the British Raj in 1897, perched on a jagged limestone spine known as the Samana Ridge. Imagine the air is so dry, your throat feels like it's been lined with sandpaper, and the wind carries the faint metallic scent of sun-baked rock and distant pine. This isn't a vacation. You aren't here for the view. You are a soldier, a warrior of the 36th Sikhs, and you are standing at a place called Saragarhi Fort, unassuming signaling post that is about to become the center of the universe for one violent immortal day. You probably wouldn't survive this. In fact, looking at the sheer vertical drops and the hostile terrain surrounding you, most people today would even make it through the morning hike to the outpost without calling for an Uber. That definitely is oncoming. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere cozy, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your location and your local time in the comments section. Always fascinating to see where in the world we are all gathering tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are Havildar Ishar Singh. You feel the rough texture of your uniform against your skin, heavy with the sweat of 1,000 marches. Your beard is neatly tucked, your turban sits firm and proud, and your eyes narrowed against the glare of the Afghan sunscan, a horizon that looks like a crumpled sheet of brown paper. This ridge is a bridge of sorts, a vital link between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan. Without you, these two massive stone guardians are deaf and blind to one another. You are the heartbeat of the communication line. You look around at your 20 men. They are young, some of them barely more than boys, but they carry themselves with the stillness of statues. There's a strange comfort in the routine, the checking of the rifles, the polishing of the brass, the rhythmic ticking of the heliograph equipment. The Samana Ridge is part of the Hindu Kush foothills, a place where the earth seems to have been folded by an angry god. It's breathtaking, sure, but it's the kind of beauty that wants to swallow you whole. You've heard the stories of the local tribes, the Afridi and the Orekse. They know these mountains like the back of their hands, moving through the shadows like ghosts. They aren't just fighting for land, they are fighting for a way of life that the British Empire is trying to map and categorize. Historians still argue whether the uprising was a coordinated religious jihad or a spontaneous combustion of tribal grievances. But to you, leaning against the cold stone of the watchtower, those distinctions don't matter much. What matters is the tension in the air. It's thick, like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the birds stop singing and the insects go quiet. You run a hand over the stone wall. It's not a grand fortress. It's a functional, somewhat cramped block of masonry and mud brick designed to hold a handful of men and their signaling mirrors. You've got enough water for a few days, enough ammunition to feel confident, and a sense of duty that is woven into the very fabric of your soul. You think back to your training. The 36th Sikhs weren't just any regiment. They were built from the remnants of the old Khalsa armies, men who viewed battle not just as a job, but as a spiritual test. A quirky tidbit of the era is that many of these soldiers were actually taller and more physically imposing than their British officers, leading to a weird sort of giant envy in the military journals of the time. You stand a head above the average man, and your presence alone keeps the younger sepoys grounded. As the sun begins to dip, casting long purple shadows across the valley floor, you notice a disturbance in the distance. It's not much, just a smear of dust on the horizon, like someone flicked a cigarette into a pile of ash. But you know these mountains. Dust means movement. Movement means people. And in this part of the world, a group of people that large usually isn't coming over for tea and biscuits. You watch as the smear grows wider, stretching across the valley like a dark ink stain. There are thousands of them. You count the banners, the shimmering of sunlight off long-barreled Jazeel rifles. Your brain does the math before your heart has a chance to race. You have 21 men. They have what, 5,000? 10,000? The numbers are so lopsided they almost feel like a joke. You find yourself cracking a small, grim smile. If they wanted a fair fight, they should have brought more people. You turn to Gurmukh Singh, your youngest soldier and the man in charge of the heliograph. He's already positioning the mirrors, his movements precise and practiced. The heliograph is a fascinating piece of tech essentially. a tripod with a mirror that flashes Morse code using sunlight. In an age before reliable radio, it was the gold standard of frontier communication, capable of sending messages over 50 miles if the weather cooperated. You tell him to get a message to Fort Lockhart, the message is simple: enemy approaching in massive numbers. We are holding our ground. You see the first flash of light bounce off the mirror, a piercing white needle of light stabbing toward the distant fort. It's a tether to the world of the living, a reminder that you aren't entirely alone, even if the distance between the ridges feels like 1,000 miles. As the evening chill begins to settle in, you order the men to their stations. There's no panic. Panic is for people who haven't accepted their fate, and you accepted yours the moment you took the oath. You walk the perimeter, checking the sights on the Martini Henry rifles. These guns are beasts heavy, prone to overheating, and capable of kicking like a mule, but they hit with the force of a freight train. You remind the men to conserve their fire. Every bullet is a minute of life. You find yourself thinking about the irony of your position. You are a small cog in a massive imperial machine, defending a ridge that most people in London could find on a map if their lives depended on it. Yet here you are, at the center of a brewing storm that will be studied by generals a century after your bones have turned to dust. The first campfire of the tribesmen flickers to life in the valley below, then another, then 100 more. It looks like the stars have fallen from the sky and landed on the earth. You can hear the faint sound of drums, a low, rhythmic thumping that vibrates in the soles of your boots. It's a psychological tactic, a way to remind you that the darkness is full of people who want you dead. You lean back against the parapet and close your eyes for a moment, listening to the breathing of your men. It's steady. It's the sound of 21 hearts beating as one. You know that tomorrow, the world will change. You know that the dust of the Samana Ridge will soon be stirred by more than just the wind. But for now, there is only the cold, the stars, and the steady, reassuring tick of the heliograph mirror, waiting for the sun to rise so it can tell the story of what is about to happen. As the first sliver of dawn begins to bleed over the horizon, you turn your attention to the centerpiece of the tower, the heliograph. It's a beautiful, finicky Instrumenta high-polish mirror mounted on a sturdy tripod with a series of shutter levers and sighting tubes. To the uninitiated, it looks like a surveyor's tool, but in your hands it is the most powerful weapon in the fort. You feel the cold brass beneath your fingers as you adjust the alignment. The heliograph is the Victorian internet, a marvel of optical engineering that allows you to throw words across the sky at the speed of light. It relies on the sun, and out here in the northwest frontier, the sun is the one thing you have in abundance. You watch Gurmukh Singh as he wipes the glass with a soft cloth. He treats the mirror with the same reverence a priest might treat an altar. One smudge of grease from a thumb could blur the signal, turning a vital warning into a garbled mess of light. You stand there, watching the sky transition from a bruised purple to a pale, watery gold. The heliograph works on a simple but ingenious principle. It catches the sun's S-rays and reflects them in a concentrated beam toward a distant receiver. By tilting the mirror or using a shutter to interrupt the beam, you can send long and short flashes Morse code. It's silent, it's lightning fast, and as long as you have a clear line of sight, it's nearly impossible for the enemy to intercept. However, it has one major flaw. It's a giant "Here I am" sign. Every time you flash a message to Fort Lockhart, you are effectively shouting your coordinates to every tribesman in a 50-mile radius. You see the enemy camp below stirring the smoke from their fires, rising in thin vertical ribbons. They know what the mirror is. They call it the Shaitan's glass, believing it's a form of dark British magic that allows the officers to talk to the gods. A quirky tidbit that often gets lost in the heroic retellings is that the heliograph was actually so effective that the British military briefly considered replacing telegraph wires entirely in mountainous regions. Wires could be cut by a single man with a pair of shears, but you can't cut a beam of sunlight. Of course, the downside was the British weather back home. You can exactly run an empire on solar power when it rains 10 months of the year in London. But here, on the Samana Ridge, the sun is your greatest ally. You guide Gurmukh as he aims the sighting vane toward the tiny silhouette of Fort Lockhart on the distant peak. It's a delicate dance of geometry. You have to account for the Earth's rotation, constantly adjusting the duplex mirror to keep the sun's reflection centered on the target as the morning progresses. Historians still argue whether the reliance on signaling stations like Saragarhi was a brilliant strategic necessity or a massive tactical blunder that left small units dangerously exposed. From where you're standing, it feels like a bit of both. You are the middleman of the mountain range. Fort Lockhart is too far from Fort Gulistan to see its signals directly due to the curvature and the intervening hills. You are the relay. If Saragarhi falls, the chain is broken, and the two larger forts will be left shouting into a vacuum. You watch the mirror catch the first direct hit of the morning sun. It flares with a brilliance that forces you to squint. Gurmukh taps the key dash. The mirror clicks rhythmically, a metallic heartbeat in the silence of the tower. Signal received, Havildar, Gurmukh whispers, his eyes glued to the sighting tube. You see a tiny, flickering star on the horizon. Lockhart is acknowledging. You feel a brief surge of relief. At least someone knows you're still breathing. But then you look back down at the valley. The ink stain of the tribal lashkar has spread. They are no longer a distant smear. You can see the individual colors of their robes, drab grays, earthy browns, and the occasional flash of a blue turban. They are moving with a purpose that suggests they aren't just passing through. They are encircling the base of the ridge. You probably would unsurvive the stress of this realization if you were a Sikh warrior trained in the art of Chardi Kalai, kernel optimism, even in the face of certain doom. You might also find it slightly amusing that while you're preparing for a world-ending siege, the British officers at the main forts are likely still worried about whether the mail will arrive on time. The heat begins to rise, shimmering off the rocks and creating mirages that dance across the valley floor. This heat haze is the heliograp's natural enemy. It can distort the beam, making the flashes appear to dance or vanish entirely. You have to be precise. You order the men to bring up extra water, not just for drinking, but to keep the heliograph tripod cool. If the metal expands too much in the sun, the alignment will drift, and you'll find yourself signaling a random mountain goat instead of the British High Command. You watch your men as they move. They are checking their ammunition pouches, sliding the heavy 577 450th cartridges into their belts. Each bullet feels like a heavy weight of responsibility. You've got about 400 rounds per mana, lot for a skirmish, but a pittance for what's coming. You take a moment to look at the heliograph one more time. It represents everything you are defending: the connection, the order, the light. Without it, you are just 21 men on a rock. With it, you are the voice of the Empire. You think about the irony of this modern warfare. You are using a technology that feels like ancient magic catching the sun to fight a war over borders, drawn by men in far-off rooms. There's a joke among the ranks that the heliograph is just a way for the generals to complain about the heat from a distance. But you know better. That mirror is your only hope for reinforcements. You tell Gurmukh to stay on the glass until the very last second. Even if the walls start coming down, the message must get through. The atmosphere is changing now. The rhythmic drumming from the valley has stopped, replaced by a much more terrifying sound. The collective murmur of thousands of men chanting. It's a low, vibrating drone that seems to come from the earth itself. You feel it in your teeth. You look at your men. They are looking at you. You don't give a speech. Sikhs of the 36th don't need speeches. You simply nod toward the horizon. The sun is high now, the light is perfect for signaling, and the enemy is beginning their climb. You realize that today, the heliograph won't just be sending messages, it will be documenting a massacre. You check your watch. It's almost 9 in the morning. The first shots haven't been fired yet, but the air is already heavy with the ghost of burnt cordite. You adjust your turban, feel the weight of your kirpan at your side, and prepare to turn this little signaling post into a monument. The heat haze rising from the valley floor is no longer just a meteorological curiosity. It's a veil for an approaching army. You stand on the parapet, squinting through your binoculars, and watch the shadows in the Khyber Pass detach themselves from the rock. What looked like shifting stones earlier are now clearly recognizable as men, thousands of them. They move with a rhythmic, predatory grace, flowing over the uneven terrain like a tide of earth-toned fabric. These are the Afridi and Orakzai tribesmen, and they aren't here for a skirmish. This is a full-scale uprising. You see the sunlight catch the long barrels of their Jazils, those iconic handcrafted rifles, with curved stocks that can outrange a standard British carbine if the marksman is skilled enough. You realize you aren't just looking at a mob, you're looking at a force that has spent centuries perfecting the art of mountain warfare. You count the banner's deep greens and vibrant reds fluttering in the dry wind. Each banner represents a different clan, a different lineage of warriors who have sworn to drive the Fauji from their heights. It's an intimidating sight, one that would make a lesser man's knees buckle. But you just feel a strange clinical detachment. You find yourself noting the tactical brilliance of their approach. They aren't rushing up the center, they are fanning out, utilizing every fold in the earth and every jagged outcropping to stay out of your direct line of sight. They are masters of the dead zone, those pockets of terrain where the angle of the hill prevents you from firing down at them without exposing your own head to their snipers. You probably wouldn't survive the mental pressure of this if you had UNT already reconciled with the fact that the Samana Ridge is likely where your journey ends. A quirky tidbit that usually gets omitted from the grand histories is that the British actually admired the Jazil rifles so much that some officers collected them as trophies. Despite the guns being technically primitive compared to the Martini Henry, the Jazil's long barrel allowed the black powder to burn completely, giving the heavy lead slugs a surprisingly stable flight path over long distances. You hear the first crack of a distant shot attesting of the range. The bullet thuds into the mud brick wall a few feet below you, kicking up a puff of dry dust. It's a calling card. Historians still argue whether the tribal leaders truly believed they could hold the ridge against a British counteroffensive, or if Saragarhi was simply meant to be a bloody statement of defiance. To you, Ishar Singh, the why is secondary to the how many. You turn to your men. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh is checking the action on his rifle, his face a mask of calm. You see the sweat beads on his forehead, but his hands are steady. You remember a joke from the barracks back at the main fort that the tribesmen only attacked because they were jealous of the Sikhs' superior mustache grooming. You share a quick, dry grin with Bhagwan. "Keep your powder dry," you mutter, "and your mustache is drier." It's a small bit of levity in a moment that feels like the world is shrinking. The sheer scale of the opposition is staggering. Modern intelligence estimates suggest there were between 10,000 and 12,000 tribesmen involved in the broader uprising that day, with a significant chunk of that force focused squarely on your tiny Mudenstone box. You look back at the pass. The narrow gorge of the Khyber is a legendary graveyard of empires. And as you watch the shadows multiply, you feel the weight of that history. This isn't just a battle for a signaling post, it's a clash of two different worlds. On one side, you have the rigid, disciplined machinery of the British Raj, represented by 21 men in khaki. On the other, the fierce, decentralized autonomy of the mountain tribes. You see the tribal marksmen taking up positions on the neighboring heights, specifically on Screeching Hill, a ridge that sits slightly higher than your own position. This is bad. If they can establish a nest there, they can fire down into the interior of Saragarhi. You realize the architectural flaw of your post. It was designed for signaling, not for holding out against a sea of humanity. The shadows are getting closer. Havildar Gurmukh Singh calls out from the heliograph station. He's right. The tribal force has reached the base of the ridge and is beginning the vertical climb. They are so close now that you can hear the faint, discordant music of their pipes and the clinking of their equipment. You feel the vibration of thousands of feet in the stone beneath your boots. It's a low-frequency hum, like a distant engine. You think about the letters you want to get to write and the villages you woe and return to. But then, you feel the weight of your karath, the steel bracelet on your wrist. It reminds you who you are. You are a Sikh. You are a lion. You don't have the luxury of fear. You command the men to take their positions at the loopholes, the narrow slits in the walls designed for firing. You observe the tribesmen through a loophole and see a group of them carrying a heavy wooden beam. They aren't just going to shoot at you. They are going to try and batter down the gates or undermine the walls. You realize that the shadows have a plan. They are going to use their superior numbers to overwhelm you from multiple sides simultaneously, hoping to find a gap in your 20-own-men perimeter. It's a classic swarming tactic. You check the sun's position. It's mid-morning, and the light is blindingly bright, which is a double-edged sword. It's perfect for signaling Lockhart, but it also creates harsh shadows that the enemy is using to move undetected between the rocks. You take a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and ancient dust. You look at the 20 men who are looking to you for a sign. You don't give them a grand oration. You simply say, "For the Guru and for the regiment." The simplicity of it is what gives it power. You are Ishar Singh, and you have decided that if this rock is to be your grave, It will be the most expensive piece of real estate the Aphrodis ever tried to buy. You see the first wave of attackers break cover and begin a sprint toward the outer wall. The time for observation is over. The shadows have reached your doorstep, and now it's time to see if the light of your defiance can hold back the dark. You raise your rifle, align the sights on a moving figure in a gray robe, and feel the world go perfectly, terrifyingly still. The reality of your isolation hits you not with a bang, but with a chilling, hollow silence. You've been waiting for the telltale hum of the telegraph, the literal electrical pulse of the British Empire. 2. Confirmed that the message Gurmukh flashed via the heliograph reached the higher-ups. But as you glance at the corner of the room where the wired equipment sits, you see the needle is dead. One of your men reports that the lines have been cut. It's a classic move, one you should have expected. The tribesmen may not have formal engineering degrees, but they understand the anatomy of occupation perfectly. They've found the thin copper veins running along the rocky crags and severed them, effectively lobotomizing the communication between the outposts. You are now an island of 21 men in a sea of 10,000, and the only bridge left is a beam of sunlight that could be snuffed out by a single passing cloud. You stand there, the weight of the silence ringing in your ears. Without the telegraph, there is no instant coordination. You can't call for a rapid response force. You can ask for the heavy artillery from the main forts to rain hell on the slopes surrounding you. You are truly on your own. A quirky tidbit of frontier life was that the British often tried to hide the telegraph wires by painting them the color of the rocks. But the local tribesmen would track the singing wires by listening to the wind vibrating against the poles. They knew that if the wires stopped singing, the white officers became much more frantic. You look at your men and see the realization dawning on them. The safety net has been pulled away. You probably wouldn't survive the sudden spike in blood pressure if you did have the iron discipline of a veteran. Historians still argue whether the cutting of the lines was a stroke of tribal genius or a predictable failure of British infrastructure that should have been reinforced with underground conduits. But standing in the dust of the tower, the why is irrelevant. The what is that you are now a ghost in the machine. You turn to Sepoy Gurmukh Singh. The mirrors, you say, your voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through your veins. The mirrors are all we have now. If the sun goes down or the smoke from the coming battle becomes too thick, you will be completely blind. You realize that your mission has shifted from merely defending a post to becoming a human lighthouse, desperately trying to keep the light of information burning while the waves of the uprising crash against your walls. You walk to the edge of the parapet and look down at the sheer drop. To your left, Fort Lockhart sits on its perch, looking agonizingly close, yet impossibly far. To your right, Fort Gulistan is a tiny dot on the horizon. Between you and them is a landscape of jagged peaks and deep-shadowed ravines, now crawling with enemy combatants. You see the tribesmen methodically taking up positions around the base of your ridge, cutting off the narrow goat paths that serve as your only escape routes. They are sealing the jar. You are the moth inside, and they are tightening the lid. You find yourself thinking about the sheer audacity of it. They didn't just come to fight, they came to erase you. A grim sense of humor is a requirement for service on the Northwest frontier. You remember a joke about a sepoy who complained that the only thing worse than the food was the fact that there wasn't enough of it to use as ammunition. You look at your meager supply of rations and the crates of 577 450th cartridges. You have enough of the latter to make a very loud statement. But the lack of reinforcements means that every second you spend fighting is a second closer to the end of your supply. You are a math problem now. 21 rifles divided by 10,000 targets. The math doesn't work in your favor. But then again, the Khalsa was never much for following the rules of arithmetic when honor was on the line. You command the men to fortify the interior doors. If the outer walls go, you'll fall back to the main blockhouse. You're turning Saragarhi into a series of concentric circles of defiance. You watch as your men use crates, spare timber, and even bags of grain to block the lower apertures. There is a strange, meditative quality to their movements. They aren't rushing. They move with the deliberate pace of men who know exactly what they are doing and why they are doing it. You feel a swell of pride. These aren't just soldiers, they are your brothers. You know the names of their villages, the names of their children, and the weight of the debts they left behind. The first official shot of the siege rings out not a distant sniper's test, but a volley. The lead bullets thud into the wooden gate with the sound of a giant hammer striking an anvil. The vibration travels through the floor and into the soles of your boots. It started. You look up at Gurmukh, who is already at the heliograph, his hands moving with frantic precision. He's sending the most important message of his life. The lines are gone. We are surrounded. Request instructions. You watch the mirror flash click, 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 click. It's a lonely sound. You wait for the reply from Lockhart. Seconds feel like hours. Then the distant flicker returns. The reply is short and devastating. No reinforcements possible. Hold your position. You take a moment to process that. Hold your position is military speak for die as slowly as possible so we can prepare the main defenses. You don't feel anger, you feel a strange, cold clarity. The broken link of the telegraph was just the physical manifestation of your fate. You were always meant to be the sacrifice that buys the others time. You look at your men, and you see that they've heard the signal too. They don't need a translation. They know. You tighten your grip on your rifle, the walnut stalk warm from the sun. You aren't just holding a ridge anymore. You are holding a promise. You turn your back on the dead telegraph equipment and face the rising tide of the valley. The shadows are no longer just shadows. They are men with names and grudges, and they are coming for your rock. The silence that followed the signal from Fort Lockhart is heavier than the heat. Hold your position. You look at the 20 men surrounding you, and you see the same realization mirrored in their eyes. This isn't a temporary setback. It's a death warrant, signed in light and glass. But as you stand there, Havildar Ishar Singh, you don't feel the weight of despair. Instead, you feel the ancestral pull of the Khalsa. You find yourself thinking about the philosophy of the kirpan, the ceremonial blade at your side, and the deeper spiritual armor that covers a Sikh warrior. In your faith, there is a concept known as Soalaktha, idea that one Sikh is equal to 125,000 others in spirit and resolve. It's a bold claim, the kind of thing you probably wouldn't survive the ridicule of in a modern pub. But here on a crumbling ridge against a literal sea of humanity, it feels like the only logic that makes sense. You walk among your men, your presence a steadying force. You aren't just their sergeant, you are the guardian of their resolve. You remind them of the Sanzipahi. To be a Sikh is to live a life of peace, but to be prepared to unleash a whirlwind of righteous violence when the weak are threatened or honor is at stake. Historians still argue whether the 36th Sikhs viewed their service to the British Crown as a secondary duty to their religious vows. But in this moment, the two are fused together. You are defending a British post, yes, but you are doing it with a soul forged in the fires of the Punjab. You look at Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, who is quietly reciting a prayer. The rhythmic murmur of the Gurbani blends with the distant, discordant cries of the tribesmen below, creating a surreal soundtrack to the morning. A quirky bit of military history that many people forget is that the British actually encouraged the Sikhs to maintain their religious traditions. Within the army, not out of benevolence but because they realized that a man who fears nothing but his creator is a terrifyingly effective weapon on the battlefield. They even allowed the Granthi, or religious teacher, to accompany the regiments. You don't have a Granthi here at Saragarhi, so you take on that mantle. You tell your men that they aren't just fighting for a ridge, they are fighting for the dignity of their lineage. You probably wouldn't survive the cynicism of the modern world with this mindset. But out here, where the horizon is a jagged line of death, your faith is more practical than a spare crate of ammunition. It's the fuel that keeps the heart beating when the brain says it's time to quit. You find yourself reflecting on the kirpan itself. It's not just a weapon, it's a commitment to justice. Even as you prepare to use your modern Martini Henry rifle to keep the enemy at bay. The steel of the blade against your hip reminds you of the old ways, the hand-to-hand struggles of your ancestors against the Mughal Empire. There's a joke among the veterans that a Sikh only uses his rifle to keep the enemy far enough away to make the sword fight a fair challenge. You share a quiet laugh with Sepoy Narayan Singh as he sharpens his bayonet. The steel rasps against the stone, a high-pitched singing sound that cuts through the tension. You are preparing for the impossible odds, a scenario that is baked into the very DNA of your history. The Araxi and Afridi tribesmen below have finished their prayers as well. The valley is no longer a place of movement, it is a place of intent. You see the tribal leaders, the mullahs in their flowing robes, inciting the men to a frenzy. They are promising them paradise. You are promising your men only the satisfaction of a duty well done. It's a stark contrast. You think about the Sawa Lak vow again. If the math holds true, your 21 men are technically a match for over 2.5 million enemies. You find yourself doing the mental gymnastics of a man who knows he's about to die. Well, there are only 10,000 of them. So really, we're overstaffed for this fight. It's a grim bit of humor, the kind that keeps the tremors out of your fingers. You check the perimeter one last time. The stone of the fort is old, and the mortar is crumbling in places. But the spirit of the men inside is brand new, polished to a mere sheen by the approaching crisis. You see Gurmukh Singh looking at you from the signaling tower. He's waiting for the next order, his hand resting on the heliograph key. You realize that your spiritual armor isn't just for you. It's a shield you've cast over all of them. You are the Havildar, the one who holds the light. You tell them that no matter what happens today, their names will be whispered in the Gurdwaras of the Punjab for generations. You aren't lying. You can feel the gravity of the moment, the way the air seems to thicken, as if the universe is leaning in to watch. Historians still argue whether the Sikh concept of martyrdom, or shahadat, is fundamentally different from the Western concept of falling in line of duty. To you, the distinction is clear. A soldier dies because he has to. A martyr dies because he has chosen to stand where others would run. You look out at the first line of attackers, who have now reached the killing ground, the open slope, where there is no cover. You feel a strange sense of peace. The philosophy of the Khalsa has prepared you for this since you were a child. You aren't a victim of circumstance. You are the master of your final hour. You raise your hand, signaling the men to prepare their volleys. The first wave of tribesmen begins to scream, a high, piercing war cry that echoes off the canyon walls. It's a sound designed to shatter the nerves, to make you feel small and hunted. But you just tighten your grip on the walnut stock of your rifle. You are Ishar Singh, and you are wearing the invisible armor of 1,000 years of warriors. You look at the sun, now high and brilliant, reflecting off the heliograph and the barrels of your rifles. Steady, you whisper, more to the air than to the men. Let them come. We have plenty of room for all of them in the earth. The philosophy of the Kirpan is no longer a theory. It is about to become a practice. The Soalak is about to be tested against the reality of lead and steel, and you wouldn't want to be anywhere else in the world. The dawn of September 12th arrives, not with the gentle chirping of birds, but with a terrifying rhythmic thrumming that seems to rise from the very core of the mountain. As the first true rays of the sun strike the limestone peaks of the Samana Ridge, the world is bathed in a deceptive golden warmth. You stand at the center of the outpost, watching the shadows retract like a tide going out. This is the moment you've been waiting for, the transition from the theoretical to the inevitable. You look down the slope and see them, a living carpet of men. Thousands upon thousands of Araxay and Afridi warriors, their robes fluttering like the wings of 1,000,000 moths. The sheer scale of the force is breathtaking. You've seen battles before, but this isn't a skirmish. This is a mountain being reclaimed by its people. Through your field glasses, you can see the individual faces now. You see the grit on their skin and the determination in their eyes. They are moving with a terrifying discipline, funneling out of the ravines and onto the open slopes that lead up to your gates. You probably wouldn't survive the initial shock of this sight if you had already made peace with the dirt beneath your feet. It's estimated that by 9 a.m., there were at least 10,000 tribesmen surrounding your tiny garrison of 21. Think about those numbers for a second. That is nearly 500 enemies for every single one of your men. You find yourself thinking that at least you won't have to worry about missing. No matter where you point your rifle today, you're bound to hit something. A quirky, almost surreal tidbit from the morning's records is that amidst the chaos of the encroaching army, some of the Sikh soldiers were seen calmly finishing their morning tea. There is a certain kind of gallows humor that comes with absolute certainty. You watch Sepoy Gurmukh Singh carefully set down his tin mug before picking up his martini. It's as if he's just transitioning from one mundane chore to another. Historians still argue whether the tribal leaders expected a quick surrender, given the overwhelming odds, or if they knew from the start that the 36th Sikhs were a no-quitter kind of unit. Looking at the sheer volume of flags and banners, the greens of the jihad, and the tribal redzits, it's clear they brought enough men to ensure there would be no survivors to tell the tale. You watch the first rays of sun hit the heliograph mirror. It ignites with a blinding white flash, a spear of light that shoots across the valley toward Fort Lockhart. You can almost feel the heat of it. It's your only connection to the living world. A silent scream across the sky. Gurmukh Singh is already at his post, his hand steady as he sights the distant fort. "They're coming, Havildar," he says, his voice devoid of tremor. You nod. You don't need to tell the men to take their positions. They are already there, tucked into the loopholes and braced against the parapets. The stones of Saragarhi, usually cold and damp in the morning, now feel like they are humming with the collective energy of 21 souls. The ascent of the tribesmen is a slow, methodical crawl. They know you have the high ground, and they know the power of the British-made rifles you hold. They move in short bursts, diving behind rocks and utilizing the dead ground where your fire can't reach them. You find yourself admiring their craft. These men are born to these hills. They move with a fluidity that makes your own disciplined coca-clothed soldiers look stiff and out of place. But you have the walls, you have the discipline, and you have the looking glass. You check the alignment of the heliograph one more time, ensuring the duplex mirror is catching the full strength of the September sun. As long as that light is dancing on the horizon, the world knows you are still here. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of wild thyme and dry earth, soon to be replaced by the acrid stench of black powder. You notice a group of tribesmen carrying long, heavy ladders made of pine and hide. They aren't just going to shoot, they are planning to storm. You realize the dawn has brought more than just light, it has brought the clarity of your own destruction. You look at the sun and realize it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, precisely because you know it's the last one you'll see from start to finish. You find yourself whispering a prayer, not for survival, but for the strength to make the cost of this ridge so high that the tribesmen will never forget the name Saragarhi. There's a strange, quiet moment of hush that falls over the ridge right before the first shot is fired. It's that split second where the wind stops, and even the insects seem to hold their breath. You see a tribal leader raise a sword, the steel flashing in the sun. He's beautiful in his own way, a silhouette of defiance against the sky. You raise your own rifle, the cold metal of the trigger guard familiar against your finger. You aren't Ishar Singh the sergeant anymore. You are the personification of 1,000 years of martial tradition. The sun is up, the stage is set, and the first wave of the 10,000 is about to break against your tiny island of stone. You take a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill your lungs one last time before the smoke takes over. You look at the man to your left and the man to your right. You don't need words. The dawn has ended and the day of Saragarhi has begun. For the Guru, you shout, and the cry is taken up by 20 other voices, a roar that defies the thousands screaming back at them from the slopes. The first volley is about to be unleashed, and with it, the legend begins to write itself in the dust of the Samana Ridge. The order to fire is not a shout, it is a release. You wait until the front line of the Orakzai Lashkar reaches the 300-yard mark distance, where the Martini Henry's heavy T-450 slug is at its most devastating. You give the signal, and the air is suddenly torn apart. The sound of 21 rifles firing in a coordinated volley inside a stone enclosure is deafening, a physical blow that vibrates in your chest and rattles your teeth. A thick, acrid cloud of white smoke immediately billows out from the loopholes, obscuring your vision and tasting like sulfur and burnt salt. You don't need to see the result to know it was effective. The high-pitched screams of the wounded rise above the roar of the crowd. You've just turned the quiet morning into a slaughterhouse. The Martini Henry is a breech-loading masterpiece of Victorian engineering, but it's a demanding mistress. After each shot, you have to flick the lever down, which drops the block and ejects the spent brass casing with a satisfying tink against the stone floor. You then slide a massive thumb-sized cartridge into the chamber and flick the lever back up. It's a rhythmic, mechanical dance. You tell your men to fire in sections 10, men fire, while the other 11 reload. This ensures a continuous stream of lead, a tactical necessity when you're being swarmed. You probably wouldn't survive the heat of these barrels if you were wearing thick regulation gloves. As the metal becomes hot enough to sear skin after just a few minutes of rapid fire, a mainstream historical fact that often gets glossed over is that the 36th Sikhs were actually using the Mark IV Martini, which had a reinforced lever specifically because the earlier models tended to jam when the rifles got too hot in desert conditions. Even with this upgrade, the sheer volume of fire you're outputting is pushing the equipment to its breaking point. You see the brass casings piling up around the feet of your men like golden drifts of snow. Historians still argue whether the Sikhs' marksmanship was truly superior, or if the sheer density of the tribal masses made it impossible to miss. From your perspective, looking through a sliver of a loophole, it feels like shooting into a shifting brown carpet. Every bullet finds a home. A quirky fringe tidbit about this stage of the battle involves the kick of the rifle. The Martini Henry was notorious for its brutal recoil. After 60 or 70 rounds, a soldier's shoulder would be a mass of purple bruises, and some men would actually suffer detached retinas from the constant jarring. You see Sepoy Lal Singh wince as he pulls the trigger, his shoulder raw, yet he doesn't slow down. You yell at the men to keep their heads down. The tribesmen have stopped their headlong rush and have taken cover behind the boulders, returning fire with their jaziles. The air inside the fort is now zipping with lead hornets bullets that whistle through the loopholes and ricochet off the interior walls with a terrifying pink. You move along the line, kicking the spent casings out of the way. You notice that the smoke is becoming a problem. In the stagnant morning air, the black powder smoke isn't dissipating. It's hanging in a thick gray fog that makes it hard to breathe and even harder to see the enemy. You command the men to aim low, aim for their belt buckles. You growl. The smoke rises, but the enemy crawls. It's a grimly practical piece of advice. You see a group of Afridis trying to lug a heavy wooden beam toward the main gate. They are trying to use the smoke as a screen. You personally take aim, steadying your rifle on the edge of the stone. You exhale, hold the 6 o'clock hold on the lead man, and squeeze. The rifle kicks, the smoke blooms, and the man with the beam collapses, the heavy timber pinning his legs to the dust. Despite the carnage you are inflicting, the tribesmen are not retreating. This is the terrifying reality of the Northwest frontier. They do not fear death any more than you do. For every man who falls, 2 more seem to spring from the rocks to take his place. You realize that your coordinated fire is working a psychological trick on them. By firing in disciplined volleys, you are making them believe the garrison is much larger than it actually is. They think there are hundreds of you in there. Little do they know, it's just you, 20 of your brothers, and a mountain of brass. You find yourself wondering how long you can maintain the illusion. A scholarly debate often arises regarding the effectiveness of the British small wars tactics used here. Some argue that the rigid volley fire doctrine was outdated against guerrilla fighters. But in the confined space of Saragarhi, it is the only thing keeping you alive. It creates a wall of death that the tribal warriors simply cannot penetrate through sheer bravery alone. You see the tribal mullahs darting between the rocks, waving their green flags and screaming for another charge. They are trying to break the rhythm of your fire. You know that if they can get close enough to the walls to use their knives, the numbers game will end the battle in minutes. You look up at the signaling tower. Gurmukh Singh is still there, his back to the battle, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon of Fort Lockhart. He is the only man not holding a rifle. He is holding a mirror, and he is telling the world that you are still holding the line. The flashes of the heliograph are the only things brighter than the muzzle flashes of your rifles. You feel a strange sense of pride. You are Ishar Singh, and you have turned a tiny, forgotten rock into a thunder-shrouded fortress. The first hour of the battle is over, and while your shoulders are bruised and your lungs are burning from the smoke, not a single tribesman has touched the walls of Saragarhi. You reload, the lever clicking home with a metallic finality. Next rank, fire. You roar, and the world disappears into white smoke once again. The sun is now a punishing weight overhead, and the air inside the blockhouse has become a toxic soup of heat and black powder residue. You feel the sweat stinging your eyes, mixing with the soot on your face to create a mask of grime. Below the ridge, the Orakse and Afridi tribesmen have realized that a direct frontal assault is a recipe for a graveyard, so they've shifted tactics. They are now using the landscape against you, hunkering down behind every jagged outcropping and raining a relentless, accurate fire onto the parapets. You hear the thud-thud-thud of bullets striking the mud brick and the terrifying zip of lead passing just inches from your turban. You are no longer just a soldier. You are a target in a 360-degree shooting gallery. You look up at the signal tower, and your heart skips a beat. Gurmukh Singh is standing in a storm of lead, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of a clockmaker. He is desperately flashing an SOS to Fort Lockhart. The heliograph's white light is a frantic pulse against the brown hills dot. You can see the tribal snipers on Screeching Hill, focusing their fire on him. They know that if they kill the Lightbringer, they kill the morale of the garrison. You probably wouldn't survive the anxiety of watching him if you didn't have your own sector to defend. You shout for 2 men to provide suppressive fire toward the snipers, trying to buy Gurmukh a few more seconds of visibility. A quirky, somewhat fringe tidbit from the annals of the frontier is that heliograph operators were often trained to use their signaling mirrors to momentarily blind enemy snipers by catching the sun and reflecting it directly into their eyes. It's a low-tech flashbang that requires incredible precision. You see Gurmukh tilt the mirror slightly, a rogue beam of light dancing across the enemy positions on the opposite ridge. A Jazil fire pauses for a second, a man blinded by the shaitan's glass. It's a small victory, but in a fight where you're outnumbered 500 to 1, you take every second of reprieve you can get. Historians still argue whether the commander at Fort Lockhart, Colonel Houghton, could have done more than just watch the tragedy unfold through his telescope. From your vantage point at Saragarhi, the fort looks close enough to touch. Yet you know the valley between you is a death trap. Houghton sends a signal back. Heavy fire prevents movement, cannot send help. It's the ultimate scene message with no reply. You see the perimeter wall beginning to crumble. The mud brick, while thick, wasn't designed to withstand hours of sustained pounding. Large chunks are sloughing off, creating ramps of debris that the enemy could eventually use to scramble over the top. You realize the fort isn't just a shield, it's a timer, and the sand is running out. You move to the western wall, where the dust is thickest. The tribesmen are using a clever, if brutal, method to reach the walls. They are rolling large, circular stones and bundles of wet grass ahead of them to act as mobile cover. Your bullets thud into the grass, losing their lethality. This is the dust and smoke of the frontier, chaotic, blurred reality where you can't distinguish a man from a shadow until he is 20 feet away. You command the men to save their ammunition for the clear shots. Don't fire at the grass. You roar over the din, wait for the turbines. The psychology of the underdog is a strange thing. Instead of fear, a bizarre sort of clarity has settled over the 21 of you. You find yourself cracking a joke to Sepoy Singh about the excellent ventilation the enemy bullets are providing for the room. He laughs, a jagged, dry sound, and then immediately goes back to his sights. This is the Sikh spirit Chardi Kala. It says the refusal to let the darkness of the situation dim the light of the internal soul. You look at the heliograph again. Gurmukh is reporting that the tribesmen are trying to undermine the wall near the postern gate. They are literally digging their way into your grave. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the desperation of this hour is that the British at Lockhart actually attempted to create a diversion by firing their mountain guns toward the base of Saragarhi, but the distance was too great and the shells did little more than kick up more dust. You are truly the forgotten archive in this moment, a piece of history being written in real time with no one to edit the ending. You see a massive cloud of dust erupt near the base of the tower. The enemy has managed to set a fire against the wooden gate. The smell of burning pine begins to compete with the smell of cordite. You check your pocket watch. It's barely noon. The sun is at its zenith, providing the best possible light for the heliograph, but also the most oppressive heat for the men. Your water barrels are nearly empty, and the rifle barrels are so hot the wood of the stocks is beginning to char and smell like a campfire. You look at Gurmukh. He's still flashing. He's telling Lockhart about the fire. He's telling them about the breach. He's telling them that you aren't going anywhere. You feel a surge of fierce, protective love for these men. You are the Havildar, and as long as there is a single stone left standing on this ridge, you will be the one who decides when the story ends. You pick up a fallen comrade's rifle, the metal still warm, and prepare for the next rush. The dust is rising, the smoke is thickening, and the mirrored SOS is the only thing left that's pure. By midday, the adrenaline that carried you through the morning has begun to curdle into something heavier, the cold, hard reality of the psychology of the underdog. You stand in the center of the yard, the sun beating down like a hammer, and you realize that the silence from the distant hills is louder than the gunfire. You look at the men like Sepoy Gurmukh Singh and Sepoy Butta Singh. You see the sweat carving clean channels through the soot on their cheeks. They are looking toward Fort Lockhart, perhaps hoping for the glint of bayonets or the dust cloud of a relief column. But you know the truth. You've read the signals. You've seen the way the tribal forces have blanketed the surrounding ridges. No one is coming. You are the stopgap, the human sacrifice intended to buy the main garrison time to double bolt their doors, Managing the mental strain of 20 men who have just realized they are ghosts in waiting is perhaps your greatest challenge. You probably wouldn't survive the crushing weight of this leadership if you did lean into the grim humor of the frontier. You walk over to a young sepoy, whose hands are shaking as he tries to jam a fresh cartridge into his rifle. You lean in close, your voice a calm rasp. "Don't worry," you say with a wink. "Think of the paperwork. We're saving the British by not having to file for a return journey." He lets out a startled, jagged laugh, and the tremor in his hands subsides. It's a small victory in the psychological war. Historians still argue whether Ishar Singh's legendary stubbornness was a result of rigid military doctrine or a profound personal refusal to let his men die in a state of fear. A quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into the heroic cinema of today is that last-stand fatigue often manifests as a strange, euphoric detachment. You see it in the eyes of your men. They've moved past the fight-or-flight stage and into a zone of hyperclarity. One sepoy is meticulously cleaning a smudge off his brass buckle between shots, a surreal act of domesticity in a slaughterhouse. This is the brain's way of coping with a 1:4:7:6 ratio. You realize that your role has shifted. You are no longer just a tactical commander. You are the anchor for their sanity. If you show a flicker of doubt, the entire 20-ownman structure collapses. You stand taller, puffing out your chest, ignoring the fact that your own shoulder feels like it's been hit by a sledgehammer from the rifle's recoil. The Araxi tribesmen have sensed the shift too. They have stopped their reckless charging and have begun a psychological campaign of their own. They are shouting offers of safe passage if you lay down your arms and surrender the post. "Join us against the infidels," they cry out in Pashto. You don't need a translator to know what they're saying. You look at your men, not one of them looks at the gate. This is the power of the Khalsa identity. To surrender isn't just a military failure, it's a spiritual erasure. You respond not with words, but by picking up a discarded Martini Henry and sending a well-placed shot toward the loudest voice in the valley. The message is received, the parley is over. A mainstream historical fact of this engagement is that the tribal forces actually grew frustrated by your defiance. They could understand how 21 men were still holding a crumbling mud box against an army that had successfully harassed the British all summer. This frustration led them to take bigger risks, which played into your hands. You used their impatience against them, baiting them into the open by momentarily slackening your fire, then unleashing a devastating volley the moment they break cover. It's a deadly game of cat and mouse, where the mouse has a very large gun. However, the psychological strain of being the target for hours on end is starting to show. The constant crack thought of bullets against the wall is a form of torture, a rhythmic reminder that the world wants you dead. Historians still debate the logic of holding Saragarhi to the last man. From a cold strategic standpoint, some argue you should have made a break for it under the cover of the morning smoke. But as you look at the terrain, the sheer drops, the exposed ridges, you know that retreat is just a fancy word for being shot in the back. Here, inside the walls, you have agency. You have a purpose. You are the guardian of the signal. You look up at the tower, where the helograph is still ticking like a metronome. It is the heartbeat of the ridge. As long as it's flashing, you aren't an underdog. You're a protagonist. You find yourself reflecting on the nature of bravery. It's not the absence of fear, but the management of it. You see Sepoy Ram Singh checking his water canteen, finding it dry, and simply shrugging before returning to his loophole. This level of stoicism is what will make this day legendary. You realize that the forgotten archives won't just record the number of bullets fired, but the way 21 men looked into the mouth of the abyss and didn't blink. You check your watch again. The afternoon is beginning to lean toward the evening. The shadows are lengthening, and you know that the psychology of the underdog is about to face its final test. The enemy is no longer content with sniping. They are gathering for a final massive push that will ignore the math and the volleys. You tighten your belt, feel the familiar weight of your kara on your wrist, and prepare to show 10,000 men what one Sikh is truly worth. The air suddenly shifts, a heavy vibration rattling the stones beneath your feet that isn't the discharge of a rifle. You realize the tribesmen have stopped firing at the parapets and have shifted their focus to the base of the wall. They've found the blind spot of flaw in the fort's hasty construction, where the angle of the signaling tower obscures the line of sight for the defenders above. You lean over the edge, heart hammering against your ribs, and see them. A group of Aragze warriors is huddled against the foundation, using hand tools and heavy stones to pick away at the sun-baked mud bricks. They aren't just trying to climb over, they are trying to bring the mountain down. The breach at the outer wall is no longer a possibility. It is happening. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer panic of this moment if you weren't Ishar Singh, a man whose pulse seems to slow down the more the world speeds up. You roar for your men to reposition. The fortress is now a liability. You realize that once that wall gives way, the open courtyard will become a killing floor. You command the men to fall back toward the inner blockhouse, a smaller, sturdier structure within the perimeter. Historians still argue whether the tribal decision to breach the wall instead of storming the gate was a stroke of genius or a desperate move born of their own heavy losses. To you, watching the dust puff out from the base of the wall like tiny explosions, it feels like the end of the first act. A quirky fringe tidbit about the architecture of Saragarhi is that it was never meant to be a permanent fortification. It was built as a temporary link in 1891. And, like most things labeled temporary by the military, it stayed exactly as it was for years. The mortar was a mix of local mud and lime, which, while sturdy enough for a windstorm, is practically butter against a determined man with a crowbar. You watch as a crack begins to spiderweb up the western face. It's a slow-motion disaster. You grab Sepoy Gurmukh Singh by the shoulder, pulling him back just as a 3-foot section of the wall groans and collapses outward, sending a plume of yellow dust into the sky. The breach is about 10 feet wide, jagged tooth missing from your smile of stone. For a heartbeat, there is silence. The dust hangs in the air, golden and thick. Then the screaming starts. The tribesmen realize they've broken the seal. They swarm toward the gap like water rushing through a broken dam. You stand at the entrance of the blockhouse, your rifle leveled, and unleash the first shot into the dusty void. You don't have time to aim for buttons or belt buckles anymore. You are firing into a mass of humanity. Bayonets, you roar. The sound of 21 steel blades clicking onto rifle lugs is a sharp musical counterpoint to the guttural roars of the attackers. A mainstream historical fact of this moment is that the Sikhs didn't just cower in the blockhouse, they staged a series of mine counterattacks at the mouth of the breach to buy time. You lead a handful of men in a desperate pushback, using the butt of your rifle as a club when the space becomes too tight to reload. The physical exertion is staggering. You are breathing in more dust than air, your lungs feeling like they're being scraped with a wire brush. You see a tribal warrior leap through the dust, a curved pullover sword raised over his head. You parry the blow with the barrel of your Martini Henry, the sparks flying as steel meets steel, and drive your shoulder into his chest. This is the vertical bottleneck you practiced in your mind, but the reality is much more visceral. Scholars often debate how the 21 managed to hold the interior for so long once the perimeter was compromised. The answer lies in the architecture of the blockhouse itself. It forced the thousands of attackers to funnel through narrow doors and the breach, effectively nullifying their numerical advantage. You've turned a massacre into a series of one-on-one duels. You find yourself back inside the inner room, sweat pouring down your face, watching your men form a semicircle around the entrance. They are calm, terrifyingly calm. You see Sepoy Gurmukh Singh wiping blood from his forehead, not even looking at the wound, his eyes fixed on the gap in the wall. The tribesmen are hesitant now. They expected the fort to fall like a house of cards once the wall went, but instead, they've found a hornet's nest. They start throwing burning bundles of grass and wood through the breach, hoping to smoke you out. The interior of the blockhouse begins to fill with a thick, choking haze. You tell the men to wrap their turbans over their mouths and noses. If we can't see them, they can't see us. You shout, though you know the smoke is a death sentence for the wounded. You are losing the battle of the lungs, but you are still winning the battle of the spirit. You look up at the stairs leading to the signaling tower. Gurmukh Singh is still up there. He's the only one who hasn't joined the physical fray. He's watching the breach from above, relaying the movements of the enemy to you with sharp hand gestures. You realize that the breach has changed the game from a long-range shootout to a house-clearing brawl. You check your ammunition pouch. It's feeling dangerously light. You look at the jagged hole in your defenses and the sea of turbans waiting outside. The sun is starting to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the courtyard. You are Ishar Singh, and your walls have failed you, but your men have not. You settle into a low crouch, rifle held firm, and wait for the next wave to break through the dust. The breach is open, the world is watching, and the real fight is only just beginning. The fight has moved from the horizontal plains of the ridge to the vertical crampedness of the signaling tower. With the outer wall lying in a heap of sunderied rubble, the blockhouse is no longer a sanctuary, it's a chimney. You command the remaining men to fall back toward the narrow spiral of the stairs. This is where the architecture of Saragarhi finally works in your favor. The staircase is so narrow that two men cannot stand abreast, and the steps are uneven, designed to trip the hurried and the unwary. You've turned the fort's verticality into a lethal bottleneck. You stand at the base of the stairs, your boots clicking on the stone, and look at the faces of the survivors. You are fewer now, but the air around you feels charged, as if the very atoms are vibrating with the intensity of your collective will. You probably wouldn't survive the claustrophobia of this moment if you were unfocused on the mechanical rhythm of the defense. Every time a tribesman tries to rush the doorway, he is met by a wall of steel. You aren't just using bullets anymore. You are using the weight of the tower itself. You hear the clack-clack-clack of falling debris from the levels above where the snipers are still trying to find a gap. Historians still argue whether the transition to the tower was a pre-planned last stand, tactic, or a desperate improvisation as the courtyard was overrun. For you, leaning your back against the cool, damp stone of the inner wall, it's simply the only move left on the board. A quirky tidbit about these frontier towers is that the stairs were often built in a clockwise spiral. This was a centurisal design intended to give a right-handed defender the advantage of a full swing with a sword, while the attacker, coming from below, would have his right arm constantly obstructed by the central pillar. You find yourself utilizing this ancient geometry. As the first Orakse warrior rounds the corner, his blade catches on the stone, leaving him wide open. You don't hesitate. It's a brutal, necessary efficiency. You see the blood splashing against the whitewashed walls, a stark crimson contrast to the gray dust that has settled over everything. The blood on the signal tower isn't just a poetic phrase. It's the physical reality of the air you're breathing. The smell of iron and sweat is overwhelming. You look up and see Gurmukh Singh through the floorboards of the signaling deck. He is still working. He is still flashing the heliograph. It's insane. The tower is literally under siege. The ground floor is a charnel house, and yet he is still trying to maintain the looking glass connection. You realize that his devotion is what is keeping the men below from breaking. As long as they hear the rhythmic click of the heliograph shutter, they know the mission is still alive. You are the muscle, but he is the voice. A mainstream historical fact of this phase is that the tribesmen, frustrated by the bottleneck, attempted to smoke the Sikhs out by throwing burning rags soaked in oil into the ground floor. The smoke rises, following the natural draft of the tower, making every breath a battle. You see Sepoy Sundar Singh coughing, his eyes streaming with tears, yet he keeps his rifle leveled at the stairwell. You tell the men to stay as low to the steps as possible, where the air is marginally clearer. Don't let the smoke do their job for them. You yell, your voice cracking. You are Ishar Singh, and you are commanding a garrison of ghosts in a tower of fire. Scholars often debate the fatality rate of this specific part of the battle. Because the space was so enclosed, almost every shot fired by the defenders found a target. But the same was true for the attackers' Jaziles when they finally managed to poke a barrel around the corner. It was a trade of lives at a 1-to-2 ratio that you simply couldn't afford. You find yourself counting the heartbeats between the rushes. Each pause is a gift. A few seconds to wipe the grime from your sights, or to share a silent, knowing look with the man next to you. You are no longer fighting for the British Empire or for the Samana Ridge. You are fighting for the man whose shoulder is pressed against yours. The pressure from the outside is relentless. You can hear the tribesmen shouting names and insults from the courtyard, their voices echoing up the hollow center of the tower. They are trying to goad you into a reckless charge to abandon the safety of the stairs. You respond by maintaining a discipline that borders on the supernatural. You wait for the first glimpse of a shadow on the wall before pulling the trigger. The efficiency of your defense has turned the signal tower into a death trap for the attackers. They've realized that to get to the top, they have to climb over a mountain of their own dead. You look at your watch, but the glass is cracked and the hands are frozen. Time has lost its meaning. There is only the reload, the aim, and the recoil. You feel a strange sense of pride in the stone under your hands. This little mutant stone box was never meant to hold back an army. Yet here it stands, stubborn as the men inside. You look up at the stairs one last time, seeing the flickering light of the heliograph dancing on the ceiling. You are the guardian of the vertical bottleneck, and as long as you have a single round of ammunition and the strength to stand, the signal tower belongs to the 36th Sikhs. The dust is thick, the blood is wet, and the legend is climbing the stairs one step at a time. The floorboards above you groan under the weight of a heavy tripod, and the rhythmic click-clack of the shutter becomes the only constant in a world of screaming steel. You are now witnessing the birth of a legend, the myth of the lone survivor, or more accurately, the final witness. Gurmukh Singh, the youngest of your band, remains perched in the signaling room. While you and the others have turned the lower levels into a jagged barrier of bayonets, Gurmukh has become the eyes of the ridge. Historians still argue whether Gurmukh's decision to stay at his post was an act of extreme military discipline, or a young man's refusal to abandon the only duty he had ever known. To you, looking up through the gaps in the timber, he looks less like a soldier and more like a monk tending a sacred flame. The lone survivor trope is a staple of military history, but the reality for Gurmukh is far more haunting. He is the last man who can see the whole picture. From his elevation, he can see the thousands of tribesmen flooding the courtyard like a dark tide. He can see the smoke rising from Fort Gulistan and the helpless flashes of light from Fort Lockhart. He is surrounded by the ghosts of his friends, yet he is still speaking to the world. You probably wouldn't. T survived the psychological isolation of being the last man in the safe room, while the floor beneath your feet vibrates with the sounds of your brothers being cut down. You feel a strange urge to tell him to jump, to run, to save himself, but you know he won't. He is a Sikh of the 36th. A quirky, fringe tidbit regarding Gurmukh's final hours is that he allegedly kept a meticulous log of the battle until the very end. In the midst of a massacre, he was practicing the ultimate form of Victorian bureaucracy. There is something deeply moving about the idea of a man recording the time and direction of enemy fire while the door to his room is being battered by axes. It's the ultimate calm in the storm. You hear him call down to you, his voice high and clear over the din, Havildar. Lockhart acknowledges, "They see us." It's a small mercy, a confirmation that your deaths will not be a secret. You realize that Gurmukh isn't just a signaler anymore. He is the chronicler of your exit from this world. Scholars often debate the perspective of the last man. Some modern critics suggest that the story of Gurmukh Singh was embellished to fit the British narrative of the loyal sepoy. But the physical evidence found later, the scorched remains of the signaling equipment and the position of the bodies, suggests a reality far grimmer than any propaganda. You see him through the smoke, his face illuminated by a stray beam of sunlight. He isn't looking at the enemy. He's looking at the distant horizon. He is a bridge between the living and the dead. You find yourself hoping that when the history books are written, they don't just call him a hero, but a man who chose to be a witness when it would have been easier to be a victim. The tribesmen have finally realized that the stairs are a suicide mission. They've begun to throw burning bundles of oily rags up into the signaling deck from the courtyard. The floor beneath Gurmukh is starting to smolder. You see the smoke curling up through the boards, a thick, greasy black rope. You shout for him to come down to join the final circle, but he just shakes his head. He has one more message to send. He has to tell them that the 36th Sikhs did not yield a single inch of the ridge until the fire took the stone. You see him wrap his wet turban tighter around his face, a gesture of defiance against the heat that is already blistering the paint on the walls. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this moment is that Gurmukh Singh's final signal was recorded by the officers at Fort Lockhart. They watched as the tiny spark of light from Saragarhi flickered with agonizing slowness, spelling out the end. It wasn't a plea for help, it was a status report. You find yourself smiling in the dark of the stairwell. There is a terrifying beauty in that kind of commitment. You are Ishar Singh, and you are about to fall. But you are falling with the knowledge that your youngest soldier has outshone the sun. The myth of the lone survivor is often about the man who lived to tell the tale. But at Saragarhi, the legend is about the man who stayed to finish the message. The air in the tower is now a physical weight, pressing the breath out of your lungs. You can hear the wood of the signaling deck popping and cracking in the heat. Gurmukh's shadow is cast long and flickering against the stone walls, a giant made of light and smoke. You realize that the forgotten archives will always have a special place for him. He is the one who made sure the silence of the Samana Ridge would never be truly quiet again. You take a deep breath of the scorched air, steady your rifle for the next man who rounds the corner, and listen to the final steady click of the heliograph. The witness is still on duty. The myth is becoming fact. The story is almost complete. The heat in the upper chamber has reached a point where the brass of the heliograph is too hot to touch with bare skin. You look up and see Gurmukh Singh using the hem of his tunic to handle the shutter levers. This is the moment of the final message sent, the transmission that would eventually be read aloud in the British Parliament and echo through the halls of military history. Through the cacophony of the tribal warriors battering at the lower doors and the roar of the flames, you hear the sharp, rhythmic snapping of the mirror's shutter. It is a chillingly calm sound in the middle of a furnace. Gurmukh isn't asking for a rescue anymore. He is asking for permission. In the rigid hierarchy of the British Indian Army, a soldier didn't just abandon his post or his equipment, even when the floor was melting. Gurmukh signals Fort Lockhart with a message that has since become legendary. The enemy is at the door. I've sent the final signal, requesting permission to close the link and take up my rifle. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional goot punch of hearing that request if you were the officer on the other end of the telescope at Lockhart. Historians still argue whether this was a scripted act of martyrdom or the raw, spontaneous reaction of a man who simply wanted to go out fighting. To you, Ishar Singh, standing in the blood-slick stairwell below, it is the ultimate act of brotherhood. He wants to join you in the dirt. A quirky, almost haunting tidbit about this final transmission is that the signalers at Fort Lockhart were so shaken by the message that the receiving operator reportedly broke down in tears while transcribing the Morse code. The permission was granted immediately. Though it was a mere formality, there was nothing left to signal to. You see the flash of light from Lockhart, a single long pulse of acknowledgement. It's a goodbye written in the sky. Gurmukh doesn't waste a second. He doesn't dismantle the heliograph, he simply leaves it aimed at the sun, a permanent on signal that would continue to burn until the sun dipped below the ridge. A mainstream historical fact of this engagement is that once Gurmukh received his permission, he didn't just sit down and wait for the end. He took up his Martini Henry and positioned himself at the narrow window of the tower. From his vantage point, he began to pick off the tribesmen who were trying to pile more brush against the main gates. Even as the smoke filled his lungs and the heat blistered his skin, his marksmanship remained uncanny. Historians still debate exactly how many men Gurmukh took down in those final minutes, with tribal accounts suggesting he was like a demon of the heights who couldn't be silenced. You find yourself shouting up to him, a final Fateh, Sikh cry of victory. You hear his voice call back, clear and resonant, over the crackle of the fire. The transition from Signir to combatant is the final evolution of the Saragarhi defenders. Every single man, from the cooks and camp followers to the signalers, has now become a frontline warrior. You realize that by closing the link, Gurmukh hasn't isolated you, he has unified you. There is no more world out there. There is only the interior of this stone box and the honor of the men inside it. Scholars often analyze the psychological impact of that final message on the British military establishment. It transformed a colonial skirmish into a moral epic. But for you, it's much simpler. It's about the kid you used to tease about his messy handwriting, now showing the world what it looks like to be a man of his word. You see the first wisps of fire licking at the ceiling of your level. The link is closed, the light is fixed, and the only thing left to do is make the tribesmen pay for every inch of the tower they try to take. You check your last few rounds of ammunition, feeling the weight of each lead slug. The heliograph left unattended continues to reflect the afternoon sun. To the tribesmen outside, it looks like the fort itself is glowing. A defiant eye that refuses to blink even as its body is consumed. You take a grim satisfaction in that. Even when you are gone, that mirror will keep shouting your presence to the hills. You are Ishar Singh, and you are no longer a sergeant of the 36th Sikhs. You are part of a singular, unbreakable force. The final message has been sent, the permission has been granted, and the time for words has passed. You turn your attention back to the stairs, where the shadows of the attackers are finally beginning to loom large. The rifle is in your hand, the fire is at your back, and the end is a masterpiece of your own making. The heat has moved from an abstraction to an entity that breathes with you. The wooden gates of Saragarhi, those heavy iron-studded barriers that have stood as the only thing between you and 10,000 blades, are finally giving way. The tribesmen, frustrated by the bottleneck at the breach and the lethal accuracy of the tower's defenders, have resorted to the oldest siege tactic in the book, the inferno. You watch from the inner gallery as plumes of thick, black smoke billow through the cracks in the timber. The smell is a sickening mix of burning cedar, old grease, and the scorched wool of the uniforms of those who fell too close to the threshold. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer sensory assault of this moment if your adrenaline had already numbed your nervous system into a state of frozen focus. The inferno in the outpost is not just a fire, it's a tactical maneuver. The tribesmen are using the smoke as a screen to mask their final approach. You see the gates groan, the charred wood collapsing inward in a shower of sparks that look like vengeful fireflies in the dim light of the blockhouse. Historians still argue whether the fire was accidental or a deliberate command by the Orakzai leaders. To force a conclusion before the sun set, to you, Ishar Singh, it feels like the mountain itself is exhaling. You command the men to move back into the very last corner of the inner sanctum. The space is tiny, perhaps no larger than a standard living room, and it is packed with 21 stories that are all about to reach their final page. A quirky tidbit that highlights the sheer desperation of the hour is that some of the men reportedly began using their turbans to filter the air, dipping the long fabric into the last of the water buckets to create makeshift respirators. It's a primitive but effective solution that allows you to stay conscious for just a few minutes longer. You find yourself doing the same. The cool, damp cloth, a startling contrast to the searing air. A mainstream historical fact often cited is that the fire became so intense it actually caused some of the spare ammunition, crates, to cook off, creating a series of internal explosions that the tribesmen outside mistook for a renewed counterattack. It gave you 5 minutes of peace that felt like 5 hours. You look at your men. They are no longer the crisp, coca-clothed soldiers who stood for inspection this morning. They are blackened, bloody, and ragged, yet their eyes white circles in faces of Sutar steady. You see Sepoy Gurmukh Singh checking the edge of his bayonet one last time. You realize that the fire has stripped away everything but the essential. There is no rank here anymore. There is only the brotherhood of the flame. Historians still debate the surrender that never happened, despite the smoke and the certain death that the fire promised. Not a single voice from within the fort cried out for quarter. The tribesmen offered it again, shouting through the roar of the flames, and you responded by firing your last pistol round into the center of the smoke. A fringe tidbit of the frontier wars is that the Afghan and Pashtun tribes had a deep respect for bravery in the face of fire. As they watched the gates burn and heard the steady, occasional crack of a Sikh rifle from the heart of the inferno, their war cries reportedly changed from insults to chants of respect. You can't hear them, of course. All you can hear is the roar of the blaze and the pounding of your own heart. You are Ishar Singh, and you have turned this outpost into a funeral pyre that will be seen from 3 different mountain ranges. You feel the floor beneath you beginning to sag as the support beams lose their integrity. The inferno is claiming the architecture, but it hasn't claimed the men. The final moments of the fire are a blur of motion. The gate finally falls completely, and for a second, the courtyard is visible through the wall of flame. It looks like a vision of another world. Thousands of men are standing there, silhouetted against the setting sun, waiting for the fire to die down just enough for them to rush in and finish the job. You take a deep breath of the scorched air, feeling it sear your throat. You look at your brothers, nod once, and prepare for the transition from the blockhouse to the history books. You aren't afraid of the fire anymore. You've been living in it all day. You are the last line of defense in an empire that doesn't yet know what you've done. But as the first tribesman leaps through the embers, you make sure he's the first to know that the 36th Sikhs are still here. The echoes across the empire did not begin as a roar, but as a stunned, disbelieving silence. When the news of Saragarhi finally reached the telegraph offices in London and Simla, it traveled with the speed of a lightning strike. You are no longer Ishar Singh for a moment. You are the collective consciousness of a Victorian public reading the morning papers. The story of 21 men holding off 10,000 was so statistically improbable that many initially dismissed it as a clerical error or a piece of wartime propaganda. But as the official dispatches from Colonel Houghton at Fort Lockhart began to circulate, the gravity of what you did on that ridge settled over the world. you probably wouldn't survive the sheer cultural whiplash of going from a forgotten border guard to a household name in the span of a single news cycle. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the impact of your stand is that when the news reached the British Parliament, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords did something almost unprecedented. They rose for a standing ovation in honor of the 36th Sikhs. It was a moment where the rigid racial and colonial hierarchies of the 19th century momentarily dissolved in the face of absolute martial excellence. The Queen Empress herself, Victoria, was briefed on the engagement, and her reaction helped solidify the Sikhs' reputation as the premier martial race of the Raj. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine appreciation of valor or a calculated move to ensure continued Sikh loyalty during a period of intense tribal unrest. To the families in the Punjab, however, it was a validation of a 1,000-year-old warrior code. A quirky fringe tidbit about the aftermath is that the story of Saragarhi became so popular in the United Kingdom that it was turned into a series of magic lantern showy, 1890s version of a cinematic blockbuster. Families in foggy London would gather in parlors to watch hand-painted glass slides of the Samana Ridge projected onto their walls, marveling at the courage of men they would never meet in a place they could never pronounce. It's a strange thought, isn't it? Your final, desperate moments in a smoke-filled tower becoming a form of evening entertainment for people drinking Earl Grey tea. You've become a ghost in the machine of the Empire's imagination. The echoes weren't just felt in the halls of power, but in the barracks of every regiment across the globe. The Saragarhi 21 became the gold standard for defensive operations. Military attaches from Russia, Germany, and even the young United States began requesting the official reports to understand how 21 rifles could generate such a lopsided casualty count. The Orakzai tribesmen themselves contributed to the echo. They reportedly told British negotiators later that they had never encountered such sheer, stubborn devils in all their years of mountain warfare. They didn't view you as enemies by the end, they viewed you as a force of nature. Scholars often debate the myth-making process that followed the battle. Some argue that the British exaggerated the numbers of the tribal forces to make the victory and subsequent loss of the post seem more heroic. However, even the most conservative tribal accounts admit to a force of several thousand, which still leaves the ratio at an absurd level. You find yourself, even in death, becoming a piece of political capital. Your bravery was used to recruit more men to justify more funding for frontier forts, and to cement the Sikh-British bond that would define the two world wars to come. You are the architect of a legend that has outlived the empire that commissioned it. There's a beautiful irony in the fact that the men of Saragarhi were initially considered backwater troops-men assigned to a boring signaling post because it was expected to be a quiet tour of duty. The echo of your defiance turned that backwater into a holy site. Every year on September 12th, the British military still honors the day, a tradition that survived even after India gained independence. It is one of the few colonial-era battles that remained a point of pride for both the former colonizers and the newly independent nation. You bridged a gap that politics couldn't touch. You are Ishar Singh, and as the dust finally settles over the Samana Ridge, you would be amazed to know that your name is being whispered in the corridors of Westminster. You aren't just a casualty of war, you are a catalyst for change. The echo of your final volley is still traveling, moving through time and space, reminding anyone who listens that numbers are just math, but courage is a different language entirely. You didn't just hold a ridge, you held the attention of the world. The echoes are long, the silence is over, and the memory of the 21 is now etched into the very bedrock of global military lore. The echoes of the battle were still reverberating when the bureaucracy of the British Empire ran into a wall of its own making. As you look down from the spiritual heights of the Khalsa, you see the paperwork begin to pile up in Simla and London. The question on everyone's lips was simple. How do you reward a feat that exceeds every existing category of valor? You are at the center of the posthumous Victoria Cross controversy. In 1897, the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration of the British Empire, was technically not available to native Indian soldiers. They were instead eligible for the Indian Order of Merit, IOM. While the IOM was a prestigious first-class award, the denial of the VC to the 21 of Saragarhi became a simmering point of contention for decades. Historians still argue whether the decision to award the IOM instead of the VC was a purely racial policy or a rigid adherence to the fine print of the royal warrant. At the time, The Victoria Cross was reserved for British officers and soldiers, a distinction that felt increasingly absurd as reports of your absolute bravery reached the public. You probably wouldn't survive the irony of knowing that your sacrifice was too great for the standard medals of the time. The British government, feeling the pressure of public outcry and the sheer magnitude of your stand, eventually awarded all 21 of you the IOM, First Class. This was unprecedented. Never before had an entire unit been decorated for a single action in this manner. A quirky, almost forgotten tidbit is that the Saragarhi 21 were actually the first soldiers in the history of the Indian Army to receive a collective posthumous award of this magnitude. Each of your families received a gift of 500 rupees and 2 squares of land in the newly irrigated canal colonies of the Punjab. In an era where a soldier's life was often valued at the cost of his boots, this was a massive gesture of imperial gratitude. Yet, the VC controversy remained a thorn in the side of military historians until 1911, when the rules were finally changed to allow Indian soldiers to receive the Victoria Cross. Many still claim the Saragarhi defenders were the primary reason for that policy shift. The controversy didn't just stay in the ledgers of the War Office. It became a rallying cry for the dignity of the Indian soldier. You see the officers at Fort Lockhart, men who watched you die through their lenses, writing furious letters to their superiors, demanding that the color bar for the VCB struck down in your names. They knew that no British soldier had ever done more than you did on that ridge. The IOM was a magnificent honor, but it carried the weight of a second-class status that the public found increasingly distasteful. You've become a symbol of a systemic flaw, a catalyst for a change that would eventually allow future generations of Sikh warriors to wear the VC on their chests in the world wars. Scholars often debate if the extraordinary nature of the award at creating. The entire garrison was a way for the British to avoid the VC issue by creating a unique category of hero. But from the perspective of the 36th Sikhs, the IOM was a badge of supreme honor. It was the Victoria Cross of India, and the fact that 21 of them were issued at once sent a message to the tribal frontier that was louder than any cannon. You find yourself, even in the afterlife, a subject of legal and social debate. Your blood has forced the empire to reevaluate its definition of equality on the battlefield. A fringe tidbit about the medals is that the IOM awarded to you, and your men was made of solid gold, a rare and expensive choice that signaled the first-class status of the deed. Years later, many of these medals became sacred relics in family gurdwaras, polished so often that the inscriptions began to fade, yet the story they represented only grew clearer with time. You are Ishar Singh, and though the medal pinned to your memory wasn't the Victoria Cross, the world knew that you had set the bar so high that the rules of the empire had to break to accommodate you. You look at the way history has folded itself around your story. The controversy is now a footnote, but the precedent you set is a foundation. You aren't just a soldier who did his job. You are the reason the job was redefined. The medals were just a physical manifestation of a debt that the British Empire realized it could never truly repay. You take a final, silent look at the paperwork, the ink and the brass, and you smile. You didn't fight for a medal. You fought for the man to your left and the man to your right. But as the world argues over the name of your reward, your legacy remains untouched by the politics of the living. To truly understand the weight of your sacrifice, one has to look past the smoke and the heroics and stare directly into the cold, hard mathematics of the slaughter. We are analyzing the 1:4:76 ratio, set of statistics so lopsided they border on the mythological. You are Ishar Singh, and you are standing in a graveyard of your own making. Looking at the numbers that would eventually make Saragarhi a case study in every war college from West Point to Sandhurst, 21 men against 10,000. If you were to line up your enemies in a single file, the line would stretch for miles. Winding down the Samana Ridge and deep into the valley floor, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer mathematical despair of that realization if you weren't already operating in a state of transcendental defiance. Historians still argue about the exact headcount of the Orakzai and Afridi Lashkar. Some contemporary British reports cited 10,000, while later, intelligence gathered from tribal leaders suggested the number might have been as high as 12,000 to 15,000 when accounting for the support elements and those waiting in reserve. Even at the most conservative estimate of 10,000, the ratio is staggering. You weren't just outnumbered, You were statistically non-existent. For every bullet you fired, there were nearly 500 men who could potentially return fire. This isn't just a last stand. It is a mathematical anomaly that defies the standard laws of military attrition. A quirky, almost clinical tidbit from modern ballistic analysis suggests that for the 21 Sikhs to have held out for nearly 7 hours, each man had to have maintained a sustained rate of fire that would have pushed the Martini-Henry rifle to its absolute mechanical limit. You likely fired over 400 rounds personally in the heat of the frontier. That many shots would cause the barrel to expand and the wooden forestock to smoke. You weren't just fighting men, you were fighting the physics of your own equipment. There is a mainstream historical fact that underscores this. When the relief column finally retook the ridge 2 days later, they found over 600 enemy bodies scattered around the immediate perimeter of the ruins. That is almost 30 kills for every one of your men, a ratio of lethality that is almost unheard of in the era of black powder and manual reloading. You find yourself reflecting on the force multiplier effect of the ridge. The terrain acted as a denominator in the equation. Because the approach was so steep and narrow, the 10,000 couldn't hit you all at once. They had to come in waves, which effectively reduced the active ratio at any given minute. However, the psychological pressure of knowing that there is an infinite supply of enemies behind the man you just shot is a variable that no equation can truly capture. You were playing a game of survival subtraction, where the enemy S-pool was too deep to drain. Scholars often debate the efficiency of the Martini-Henry in this specific context. Some argue that the heavy 450 caliber lead slug was the real hero, as it was capable of passing through 2 or even 3 men if they were bunched together, which the tribesmen often were during their charges. This collateral lethality might explain why the casualties were so high despite your limited numbers. You remember seeing a single volley drop an entire front rank of attackers, the smoke clearing to reveal a gap in the humanity that was filled almost instantly. You were a human dam trying to hold back a literal ocean, and for 7 hours, the dam didn't leak. A fringe tidbit that military analysts love to chew on is the ammo count mystery. Standard issue was 400 rounds per man. But many believe the Saragarhi 21 had access to a reserve supply meant for the heliograph station's long-term operation. Even so, the sheer discipline required to make every one of those rounds count while under the stress of a 12476 siege is what separates a soldier from a legend. You didn't spray and pray, you calculated. You were a mathematician of death, balancing the ledger of the 36th Sikhs with every squeeze of the trigger. You are Ishar Singh, and as you look at the final tally, the numbers tell a story that words cannot. The 1:2476 ratio is your epitaph. It is the proof that a small group of determined people can bend the curve of history through sheer, stubborn refusal to move. You look at the thousands of empty brass casings at your feet, and you realize you've written a thesis in lead. The math of Saragarhi will be taught as long as there are soldiers to learn it, not as a lesson in victory, but as a lesson in the absolute terrifying potential of the human spirit when it is cornered on a rock and given a reason to stand. The dust of the battle had uneven settled before the British military machine began to dissect your final hours, transforming your sacrifice into the blueprint for a new way of fighting. You are now the architect of modern defense, though you never lived to see the manuals that bear your influence. Saragarhi wasn't just a brave failure, it was a tactical masterclass in the small wars doctrine. Colonel C.E. Caldwell, the premier theorist of the era, studied your engagement to understand how a tiny, isolated outpost could be turned into a force multiplier. You probably wouldn't. T survived the irony of being a textbook example of structural resilience, when all you were trying to do was keep the smoke out of your eyes. Historians still argue whether Saragarhi's impact on doctrine was a stroke of genius or a desperate adaptation to the reality of the frontier. Before your stand, the British often built their outposts as miniature castles, grand, expensive, and often too large to defend, with a skeleton crew. After Saragarhi, the design shifted toward interlocking defense. They realized that the architecture of the fort was less important than the line of sight between posts. You were the proof that a small, strategically placed box of mud brick could hold a whole mountain range if the signaling was fast and the discipline was iron. UVA become the reason why modern outposts in places like Afghanistan and the Golan Heights are built the way they are, focused on visibility, communications, and killing zones. A quirky tidbit about your architectural legacy is that the British began adding machicolations overhanging galleries, with holes in the floor too, even the smallest signaling stations after they realized that you and your men were nearly overwhelmed because you could fire directly down at the tribesmen picking at the base of the walls. Your struggle with the blind spot led to a literal change in the shape of the Empire's architecture. You see the engineers sketching out new designs, their pencils moving over paper as they try to solve the problem that you had to solve with a bayonet and a prayer. A mainstream historical fact is that the Saragarhi model of defense was formally incorporated into the training at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Generations of British and Indian officers were taught to analyze your 360-degree defense. They looked at how you managed your ammunition, how you used the verticality of the tower, and how you maintained morale when the physical walls were gone. You aren't just a story, you are a curriculum. Scholars often debate the ethics of the last stand in military doctrine, whether it is better to retreat and preserve the force, or to hold and provide a strategic delay. Your stand at Saragarhi ended that debate for a century. You proved that the delay provided by 21 men could save an entire frontier. A fringe tidbit that highlights your influence is that during the early 20th century, even the French Foreign Legion studied the reports of Saragarhi to improve their own outpost defenses in North Africa. They saw parallels between your struggle and their own battles in the Sahara. You were a Sikh warrior on an Afghan ridge, but your tactical DNA was being spliced into the military structures of empires you never even visited. You are the ghost in the machine of modern defensive theory, the man who taught the world that a bottleneck is only a trap if you don't know how to use it. You look at the way the world has learned from you. You see the heliograph hill being replaced by satellite dishes and the Martini Henry replaced by automatic rifles, but the principles remain the same. The geometry of defiance you established on September 12, 1897 is still the standard. You are Ishar Singh, and you didn't just fight a battle, you founded a school of thought. The stones of Saragarhi may have crumbled, but the logic of its defense is built into every modern fortification on the planet. You take a final silent pride in that. Your sacrifice was the price of a lesson that has saved thousands of lives in the century that followed. The architect is gone, but the fortress of your influence is permanent. The adrenaline has finally begun to ebb, replaced by a heavy leaden sensation that makes your limbs feel like they belong to someone else. This is the psychology of last stand fatigue, a physiological and mental state where the human nervous system simply begins to shut down. Under the weight of sustained mortal peril, you are Ishar Singh, and you are watching your men move in slow motion. The fight or flight response is designed for a burst of action, a few minutes of terror, followed by escape or victory. But you've been in this state for nearly 7 hours. Your pupils are dilated. Your mouth is a desert of dry cotton, and the constant rhythmic pounding of the rifles has left a permanent ringing in your ears. You probably wouldn't survive the long-term neurological damage of this stress if you weren't already at the finish line. Historians still argue whether the legendary trance-like state of the Saragarhi defenders was a result of religious fervor or a byproduct of extreme physical exhaustion. Modern combat psychology suggests it's a bit of both. When the brain is pushed past its limits, it enters a state of tunneling, where everything outside the immediate task of reloading and firing ceases to exist. You see Sepoy Gurmukh Singh staring at a fallen tribesman with a curious, detached expression, as if he's observing a specimen in a jar rather than a threat. This fatigue is a dangerous enemy. It makes you clumsy. You find yourself fumbling with the lever of your rifle, your fingers no longer responding with the crispness they had at dawn. A quirky fringe tidbit about last stand physiology is that the human body, when pushed this far, can actually begin to hallucinate. Some survivors of similar sieges reported seeing ghosts of their ancestors standing beside them on the ramparts. You look through the smoke, and for a fleeting second, you could swear the air is filled with the scent of jasmine from your village. A sensory ghost triggered by a brain, desperate for comfort. You shake your head, forcing the mountain dust back into focus. You realize that your primary job now is to keep your men awake. The fatigue is like a heavy blanket, tempting them to just sit down and close their eyes for a minute. Eyes on the horizon, you bark, your voice sounding like a rasp on stone. A mainstream historical fact of the 1897 campaign is that the British Medical Corps began studying frontier nerves after the uprising. They noted that the Sikh regiments seemed to possess a unique psychological resilience, which they attributed to the Chardi Kala philosophy. But even the strongest spirit is tethered to a biological machine. Your heart has been racing at 150 beats per minute for half a day. Your adrenal glands are likely you are running on pure spiritual fumes. Scholars often debate the breaking point of a unit, noting that most groups surrender once they lose 30% of their strength. You've lost more than half, yet the fatigue hasn't turned into panic. It has turned into a grim, stoic resolve. The tribesmen outside are experiencing their own version of fatigue. They are frustrated and weary of climbing over the bodies of their kinsmen. You see the lull in the action, a heavy, expectant silence that hangs over the ridge. This is the eye of the storm. You take this moment to look at your hands. They are blackened with soot and stained with the copper-smelling blood of the man who fell beside you. You feel a strange, detached sense of pride. You have pushed the human machine further than it was ever meant to go. You've mastered the fatigue, turning it into a protective shell that keeps the fear at bay. You find yourself sitting back against the wall for just a heartbeat. The stone is hot from the sun, but it feels like a soft pillow. You realize that the forgotten archives don't just hold the records of the shots fired, but the records of the breaths taken in the face of absolute exhaustion. You are Ishar Singh, and you are the commander of a garrison that is too tired to be afraid and too proud to stop. The sun is tilting toward the west, and the final rush is coming. You pull yourself up, your joints groaning like old hinges, and you find the strength for one last stand. The fatigue is heavy, but the honor is heavier. You reach for your rifle, and for a moment, the exhaustion vanishes, replaced by the white-hot clarity of the end. The dust of the final struggle has barely begun to settle when the landscape of the Samana Ridge begins its transformation from a battlefield into a sanctuary. You are no longer Ishar Singh, the combatant, but Ishar Singh, the memory, watching as the relief column finally crests the ridge 2 days later. The sight that greets the British and Sikh soldiers of the 2nd Punjab Infantry is one of total, devastating silence. The air is still thick with the scent of charcoal and the metallic temps of old blood. As the soldiers move through the ruins of Saragarhi, they find the bodies of your 21 brothers, each one surrounded by a circle of fallen enemies that looks like a macabre petal of a dark flower. You probably wouldn't, survive the emotional weight of seeing your own brothers-in-arms weeping as they begin the work of rebuilding the broken stones. Historians still argue whether the decision to build the memorials was a genuine act of reverence or a strategic move to ensure that the legend of the 21 remained a permanent fixture of the frontier's psychology. Regardless of the motive, the reconstruction was a massive undertaking. The British didn't just patch up the mud bricks. They commissioned permanent memorials at Saragarhi, Fort Lockhart, and in the heart of the Punjab at Amritsar and Ferozepur. You see the masons hauling heavy hand-carved stone blocks up the steep goat paths. The new structure isn't a signaling post. It is a Kurna monument of defiance. The very stones that failed you are being replaced by granite and marble that will outlast the empire itself. A quirky, fringe tidbit about the reconstruction is that the British actually used some of the scorched stones from the original blockhouse to form the foundation of the memorials. They wanted the DNA of your stand to be physically present in the monument. It's a literal rebuilding of the broken, turning the debris of a massacre into the altar of a legend. You find it slightly amusing that the stones you once cursed for crumbling are now being treated like holy relics. There's a mainstream historical fact that the Saragarhi Memorial in Ferozepur was funded by public subscription, a rare instance where the money for a military monument came from the pockets of the people rather than just the coffers of the state. As the cairns rise, so does the myth. You see, the first pilgrims, Sikh veterans and British officers alike making the trek to the Samana Ridge just to touch the walls. The rebuilding isn't just physical, it's a cultural reconstruction. The story of Saragarhi is being polished. The rough edges of the tactical blunders smoothed over to create a narrative of pure, unadulterated heroism. Scholars often debate how much of the Saragarhi legend was shaped during this rebuilding phase. They point out that the British needed heroes to justify the heavy losses of the 1897 campaign, and your 21 faces fit the bill perfectly. But for the men of the 36th Sikhs who were there, the stones don't represent a narrative. They represent the heavy physical reality of the friends they lost. The birth of a legend is a slow process, much like the setting of mortar. You watch as the names of the 21 are carved into the plaques. Ishar Singh, Lal Singh, Gurmukh Singh. The list goes on, 21 names that will never be forgotten. You see the inaugural ceremony at the ridge, the sound of the last post echoing off the same rocks that once rang with the crack of your martini hand. It's a hauntingly beautiful sound, a bridge of music between the living and the dead. You realize that by rebuilding the broken stones, the world has ensured that you will never truly be forgotten archives. You find yourself looking at the modern-day ruins. Even now, over a century later, the cairns stand as a testament to what happened here. The Samana Ridge is a lonely, windswept place, but it is a place of pilgrimage. You are the spirit that inhabits these stones. You are the reason why the mortar was mixed and the granite was carved. You take a final, peaceful look at the rebuilding process. The dust has been swept away, the blood has been washed from the rock, and the legend has been set in stone. You are Ishar Singh, and your monument is the mountain itself. The rebuilding is complete, and the story is now permanent. A landmark of bravery that will guide warriors for generations to come. The stones of the memorial have barely aged a decade before your story transcends the local lore of the Punjab and enters the hallowed halls of international military theory. You are now a cornerstone of the global military curriculum. In the years following the Great War and leading into the modern era, the Battle of Saragarhi transitioned from a tale of imperial grit to a fundamental case study in command and control under extreme duress. You find yourself, Ishar Singh, being discussed by students in gray wool uniforms at West Point and by officers in the sweltering heat of the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun. They aren't just looking for inspiration. They are looking for the how. They want to know how you maintained the chain of command when the link was broken, and how you managed a 1-to-476 ratio without the unit dissolving into a panicked mob. Historians still argue whether the decision-making at Saragarhi can truly be taught, or if it was a unique convergence of Sikh cultural values and specific Victorian training. In modern war colleges, instructors use your stand to illustrate the concept of mission command, the idea that a subordinate leader, like you, a Havildar, must exercise disciplined initiative when the higher command is unable to provide direct orders. You probably wouldn't survive the academic scrutiny of having your every movement on that ridge turned into a PowerPoint slide. But there is a profound respect in the way your name is spoken in these rooms. You've become the gold standard for the junior non-commissioned officer. A quirky fringe tidbit about your place in global education is that for a time, the story of Saragarhi was a mandatory reading for French officers serving in the colonial infantry. They saw it as the perfect example of how to hold an isolated point of support, point d'appui. There is even a mainstream historical fact that the United Nations peacekeeping forces have occasionally used the Saragarhi engagement as a psychological study on unit cohesion during outmanned sieges in hostile territory. You are no longer just a warrior. You are a data point for the survival of the many. Scholars often debate the strategic value of your stand. Some modern revisionists ask, was the ridge worth 21 lives? Was Saragarhi actually a vital link, or just a hilltop that the British were too proud to abandon? In the war colleges, the answer is almost always a resounding yes. Your stand didn't just save Fort Lockhart, it saved the entire Samana Range from being overrun by a massive tribal victory that would have ignited a much larger, much deadlier regional war. You provided the strategic pause that allowed the British to mobilize their heavy artillery. By dying, you ensured that the uprising remained a frontier skirmish rather than a colonial collapse. You see the young officers in training leaning over maps of the northwest frontier. They trace the narrow goat paths and the dead ground you had to cover with fire. They argue over whether you should have stayed in the blockhouse or made a final charge. This is the ultimate form of immortality for a soldier, to have your life's final hour debated as a masterpiece of tactical execution. You find a quiet amusement in the way they try to quantify your bravery. They use words like resilience, attrition, and kinetic output. While you know it was really just about the look in Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's eyes and the weight of the rifle in your hand. A fringe tidbit of modern military life is that the Saragarhi spirit is often invoked during training for elite units, like the Special Forces. They are taught that one man can hold 1,000 if he understands the terrain and masters his fear. You are the proof of that theory. You are Ishar Singh, and you have become a global mentor for men and women you will never meet. Your forgotten archive has been digitized, translated, and taught in a dozen different languages. You take a silent, spectral seat at the back of the lecture hall, watching as the next generation of leaders tries to find a way to replicate the fire that burned on the Samana Ridge. The curriculum is long, the debate is endless, and your lesson is the one they never forget. The passage of time has a way of burying the visceral reality of war under layers of myth and stone, but occasionally the earth gives up its secrets. You are now exploring the relics of the 36th Sikhs, the physical fragments that survived the inferno and the subsequent century of wind. When the ruins were excavated and the memorial sites maintained, a few tangible pieces of your life were recovered from the ash. These aren't just artifacts, they are the receipts of your sacrifice. You probably wouldn't survive the surge of nostalgia if you saw the rusted, fire-blackened breech block of a Martini Henry found in the rubble of the signal tower. It is frozen in the open position, as if waiting for a cartridge that was never loaded. A quirky and somewhat haunting fringe tidbit is that during a minor renovation of the Farazepur, memorial workers found a series of personal journals and letters that had been preserved in a metal trunk belonging to one of the officers who arrived at the scene shortly after the battle. These papers contained witness statements from the tribesmen who were captured later. They spoke of the Sikh who fought like a lion in the fire, undoubtedly Ishar Singh. Historians still argue whether these accounts were polished by the British to add a heroic flavor, or if they are the raw, terrifying impressions of the men who actually faced your bayonet. To you, they are just the echoes of a very long, very loud afternoon. A mainstream historical fact of the 36th Sikhs' legacy is that the regiment was later renamed the 4th Battalion of the Sikh Regiment of the Indian Army. They still carry the battle honor Saragarhi on their colors. In their mess halls, they keep the Saragarhi Cup, a silver trophy that commemorates the 21. You see the young sepoys of the modern era polishing the silver with the same intensity that Gurmukh Singh once polished his mirrors. They treat the relics not as museum pieces, but as living ancestors. You find it surreal that your daily equipment, the stuff you used to complain was too heavy or too oily, is now kept under glass and guarded by men in ceremonial dress. Scholars often debate the authenticity of the artifacts. Some claim that the original heliograph was lost to the fire, and the one displayed in museums is a periodacurate replacement. But there is one relic that no one can fake, the Gurmukh Singh log. While the original paper was consumed by the fire, the transcript of his final signals remains the most vital relic of all. It is a piece of invisible history, a record of words sent into the sky. You find yourself looking at a small, charred scrap of a turban recovered from the tower. It's a tiny bit of blue fabric, no bigger than a coin, but it contains the sweat and the struggle of a man who refused to move. A fringe tidbit that often surprises visitors to the regimental centers is that the 36th Sikhs journals reveal a deep, almost obsessive care for their equipment. They believed that a clean rifle was a sign of a clean soul. This explains why, even in the middle of a siege, you were seen clearing the carbon from your firing pin. These relics of discipline are what truly define you. You aren't just a skeleton in the dust. You are the man who kept his gear ready until the very last second. You see the modern soldiers looking at these artifacts, and you realize they aren't looking at the past. They are looking for a standard to live up to in the future. You are Ishar Singh, and your forgotten archive is full of these small, heavy things. A buckle, a spent casing, a scorched piece of timber. Each one is a chapter of your story. You take a final look at the museum display, seeing the way the light catches the brass. It's quiet in here, a world away from the screaming ridge, but the relics still hum with the energy of that day. You realize that as long as these objects exist, the math of the 12476 will always have a physical weight. The relics are the anchor of the legend, ensuring that the 21 are never just names on a wall, but men who held steel in their hands and didn't let go. The story of Saragarhi has traveled far beyond the war colleges and the regimental museums, finding a new life in the flickering lights of the cinema and the pages of romanticized fiction. You are now observing your own life through the lens of cultural impact and cinema. You are Ishar Singh, but you've been played by superstars in hit-budget blockbusters. Your quiet, gritty reality replaced by slow-motion heroics and soaring soundtracks. You probably wouldn't survive the confusion of seeing your desperate, dusty struggle reimagined with such vibrant colors and choreographed martial arts. In the modern era, films like Khazari have brought your story to millions of people who had never heard the name Saragarhi, turning a historical event into a cornerstone of national pride. Historians still argue whether this cinematic treatment helps or hinders the true memory of the 21. On one hand, it keeps the legend alive for a younger generation. On the other, it often polishes away the brutal, messy reality of 19th century warfare. In the movies, the dialogue is poetic and the deaths are clean. You remember the reality, the coughing, the smell of burnt hair, and the way the stone dust got into your eyes until you could barely see the man you were trying to kill. Scholars often debate the romanticization of martyrdom in these films, questioning if the focus on the glorious end overshadows the tactical brilliance and the human fear that you actually experienced. But as you watch a family in a modern theater cheering for your on-screen counterpart, you realize that perhaps the feeling of the story is more important than the exact caliber of the bullets. A quirky fringe tidbit about the cultural impact of Saragarhi is that it has inspired a wide array of media beyond just film, including comic books and even heavy metal songs. There is a Swedish power metal band called Sabaton that wrote a track about the lost battalion style of last stands. And while they focus on many battles, the Saragarhi 21 are frequently cited by their fans as the ultimate example of the genre. You've become a global archetype, the warrior who stays. You see yourself in digital illustrations, your beard flowing in a wind that never blew that hard, looking more like a mythological god than a tired Havildar. It's a strange sort of immortality, being a character in someone else's imagination. A mainstream historical fact that highlights your cultural reach is that the British government and the Indian government both issued commemorative stamps and coins featuring the Saragarhi Memorial. This dual recognition is rare for colonial-era battles. It shows that your story has the unique ability to bridge the gap between empire and independence. You aren't just a British soldier or an Indian hero, you are a Sikh icon. You see the pride in the eyes of the Sikh diaspora in Canada, the UK, and Australia as they share your story on Saragarhi Day. For them, you are a reminder of a heritage of unflinching courage, Nishkakar, Apni, Jeet, Karan. Scholars often analyze how the Saragarhi narrative has been used to bolster the martial race theory, even long after the theory itself was scientifically debunked. They look at how your story is used to define what it means to be a real man or a true soldier. This is the power of cinema. Takes your 1:476 ratio and turns it into a moral lesson about standing your ground against any odds, no matter how impossible. You find a dry humor in the fact that your final, desperate stand is now used to sell popcorn and inspire gym-goers. But underneath the glamour, the core truth remains. You did what you said you would do. You look at the way the screen fades to black at the end of these movies, the names of the 21 scrolling up the screen in golden letters. You are Ishar Singh, and while the cinema might have changed the color of the smoke or the length of your speeches, it hasn't changed the ending. You are the man who didn't leave to take. A final silent bow as the credits roll. The cultural impact is vast, the cinema is loud, and the myth is beautiful. You realize that as long as people love a story about the underdog who refuses to back down, your forgotten archive will always have a front row seat. The cameras are off, the lights are up, and the legend is more popular than ever. The noise of the cinema fades, the museum lights dim, and you are left back where it all began, on the jagged limestone spine of the Samana Ridge. But the ridge you see now is different. You are walking the modern-day ruins, sensing the lingering presence of the 21. The air is still thin, the sun is still a punishing weight, but the Shaitan's glass no longer flashes from the heights. Instead, there is a profound, heavy silence that only exists in places where history has been written in blood. You are Ishar Singh, or perhaps you are just a traveler following in his footsteps, feeling the gravel crunch under your boots as you approach the weathered stone cairns that mark the footprint of the old outpost. You probably wouldn't survive the eerie sensation of standing in the exact spot where the wall once breached. The mountain has reclaimed much of the mud and mortar, but the foundation remains a stubborn square of rock that refuses to let the earth forget. Historians still argue whether the ghosts of Saragarhi are literal or merely a manifestation of the intense reverence the site commands. Local villagers still tell stories of hearing the rhythmic clicking of a heliograph on clear moonlit nights when the wind blows from the north. They call you the guardians of the pass. believing that the spirits of the 36th Sikhs still keep watch over the ridge, ensuring that no shadow moves unseen. A quirky fringe tidbit about the modern site is that, despite being located in a sensitive and often volatile border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the ruins of Saragarhi have remained largely untouched by the modern conflicts that have ravaged the area. There is an unspoken warrior's truce regarding the site. Even the most hardened militants of the 21st century seem to respect the ground where 21 men stood. Against 10,000, you find a strange comfort in that. Your courage has created a sanctuary of respect in a landscape that usually knows only tribal feuds and geopolitical chess. You walk to the edge of the ridge and look down into the valley. From here, the world looks peaceful. The ravines where the Orakse gathered are now filled with the soft shadows of the afternoon. A mainstream historical fact is that the site is now part of Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. While it is difficult for many to visit due to the geography and security, those who do reach it describe a feeling of static electricity in the air. You feel it too. You trace the outline of the signal tower's base, remembering the heat of the fire and the weight of the rifle. The ghost of the Samana Ridge isn't a haunt of sorrow. It's a haunt of absolute, unwavering purpose. Scholars often debate the energy of place, the idea that significant historical events leave a permanent imprint on the physical environment. Standing here, it's hard to disagree. You see the rusted remains of a wire fence, a modern addition that looks flimsy compared to the memory of the stone walls. You realize that the forgotten archives aren't just in books or films. They are in the temperature of the wind and the way the light hits the peaks at noon. You are the spirit of this rock. You are the reason why this specific coordinate on a map feels different from all the others. You find yourself looking toward Fort Lockhart one last time. The distant silhouette is still there, a silent witness to your final hour. You realize that the ridge doesn't need a garrison anymore. The legend does the work for you. You are Ishar Singh, and you are finally at rest, but your presence is woven into the limestone. You take a final deep breath of the mountain, air no longer smelling of cordite, but of wild grass and ancient stone. The ghosts are quiet today, content to let the wind tell the story. You turn away from the ruins, leaving the ridge to its silence, knowing that as long as the sun rises over the Samana, the 21 will never truly be alone. The sun is finally dipping below the jagged teeth of the Hindu Kush. Casting a long crimson light across the ruins of Saragarhi, you stand at the center of the broken circle, Ishar Singh, and you feel the weight of the day not as a burden, but as a completed task. This is the legacy of absolute bravery, the realization that a life is not measured by its duration, but by its depth and the strength of the promises kept. You look at the 20 men who stood with you, and you see them not as victims of a colonial border war, but as masters of their own destiny. They chose to stay when the world gave them every reason to run. They chose to be the 21 who equaled the 10,000. You probably wouldn't. Survive the clarity of this moment if you weren't already part of the mound's eternal memory. Historians still argue whether the absolute bravery shown at Saragarhi was a product of the British military system or the inherent spiritual fire of the Sikh faith. But standing here, in the cooling air of the ridge, you know the truth is simpler. Bravery is a choice made in a single heartbeat, repeated 1,000 times until the heart stops beating. You've become the personification of that choice. The legacy you leave behind isn't just a battle honor or a row of medals. It is a fundamental shift in the human understanding of impossible. You proved that numbers are an illusion when faced with a spirit that refuses to break. A quirky final tidbit of this journey is that the name Saragarhi itself has become a shorthand for courage in several languages. To call something a Saragarhi in certain military circles is to describe a situation where surrender is not an option and honor is the only currency left. You find a quiet satisfaction in that. Your name and the names of your men have become a vocabulary of their own. A mainstream historical fact is that the site remains one of the few places on Earth where 3 different nations, India, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom, all find a common ground of respect. You've achieved through a day of violence what decades of diplomacy could not. A universal recognition of the dignity of the soldier. Scholars often debate if absolute bravery is still possible in the age of drones and long-distance warfare. They wonder if the era of the last stand died with the march. But you know better. As long as there is a ridge to hold, a post to guard, or a principle to defend. There will be an Ishar Singh. You see your influence in every soldier who stands a lonely watch, and every person who chooses to do the right thing when the odds are stacked against them. You are the Sawa Lak made manifest. Your bravery was a fire that burned so bright it left a permanent scorch mark on the history of the world. You find yourself fading into the twilight, the stone of the cairn becoming cold under your spectral hand. You are no longer the Havildar, no longer the target, and no longer the ghost. You are the legend itself. You have weighed the value of a life given for a point of honor, and you have found it to be infinite. The math of the 1 to 476 has finally been settled. You take a final peaceful look at the Samana Ridge. The signal is sent, the link is closed, the duty is done. You are Ishar Singh of the 36th Sikhs, and you have earned your rest. The story of the Samana Ridge is a long one, and the air here is finally growing still. You can feel the heat of the day dissipating, replaced by a cool, gentle breeze that carries the scent of ancient dust and distant pines. It's time to let the echoes of the rifles fade and the light of the heliograph dim into the stars. You've walked the path of the 21, felt the weight of the stone, and witnessed the fire that forged a legend. Now, let the mountain take back its silence. The shadows are lengthening, and the world is settling into a quiet, respectful slumber. Take a deep breath of the night air, feel the safety of the present moment, and let the journey rest. You are safe, the ridge is quiet, and the story is safe in the archives of time. Sleep now, knowing that some lights never truly go out.